Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Blue Night Cast. After a few days off, I'm back, episode 4. And today I just wanted to look back on the past 8 years of the time I spent with my Nintendo Switch. And I'm doing this because it launched earlier this week, 8 years ago. And obviously, we're waiting on the next one, hopefully soon. Switch 2, major Nintendo Direct with big announcements on April 2nd, which is less than a month away. And I thought now would be a good time for me just to go back over 8 years, talk about what has transpired with it, and why it is probably now my all time favorite console or console generation. And gets a little personal for me in some ways. I'm trying to make a point not to put my personal life out here, but I may end up saying a little bit as I go. But I remember a little over 8 years ago, it was kind of tough to be a Nintendo fan at that time. I know there's some people who may be too young to know what I'm talking about, and a lot of people who just remember. But it wasn't. The generation before the Switch was not the best, for sure. And I say that because the Wii U was just a total disaster the way it went. Now, and I may do another episode in the future talking in more detail, but I always saw the Wii U as this Switch Army knife type console that did not, it deserved better recognition and developer attention and consumer attention than it got. But the fact remains, it did not get that attention, and that generation was kind of a disaster. I had my Wii U. I bought Wii U games. But there was a lot of games that did not come to Wii U because it was the Wii U. And it was just not the best time to be a Nintendo fan or a Nintendo gamer. And I did find myself that gen spending more time on my 3DS. Partly because it had more game support, partly because changes in my working life, I just needed something I could carry around more. And that being said, I really looked forward to the Switch 1 as it was approaching to be launched. It actually, when you looked at the games that were coming out for it that they announced in January 2017, well, let me go back a few steps further. I remember taking time out in October 2016 just to catch the initial trailer for Switch as it came out. I remember watching it for the first time along with everybody else for the first time. And I had read like internet stuff about how rumors and such about how it was going to be something you could dock with a TV or carry around. And I kind of wondered, would this thing be any good or not? Because don't get me wrong, I love my 3DS, but I really wanted a good home console. And watching that for the first time, watching how the Switch worked for the first time, seeing the footage of Breath of the Wild running on the Switch, and the other games that were in the trailer too, it blew my mind. I was looking at it like, finally, Nintendo gets it. And when I mean gets it, instead of having I am one of them people that thinks Nintendo is prone to fall into gimmicks to the point that hurts them. That it hurts them. Instead of having weird systems where you got two screens, or the controller is a giant tablet that's tethered by Bluetooth to the main console at the TV, or relying very heavily on motion controls to where you kind of need an open living room space to play. This was just, to me, a very pure video game console that you can carry with you. The controllers the button layout didn't look weird. Yes, you did hold it in your hands like a Wii U gamepad, but it looks smaller, or at least not as tall. And you wasn't tied to anything. You could just carry it with you to the park and play Breath of the Wild. That was, to me, that was yes. And just looking at the types of games they were showing, Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, that was mind-blowing in itself. Wait a minute, this thing plays Skyrim? I mean, I know we joke about everything playing Skyrim now, but in 2016, that was actually something. But Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, Mario Kart, well, duh. A 3D Mario, you saw a snippet of it. NBA 2K. Just seeing, and they ended with a Splatoon. And just seeing these things, it gave me two observations that actually meant something to me. One was, these weren't weird games. These were just the Mario Kart. What little we saw looked like a straight up Mario Kart. The 3D Mario game, it kind of made you think, oh, this looks like there isn't any big gimmicks tied to Mario running through the desert. Skyrim, that's pretty straightforward. You know what you're getting with Skyrim. NBA, pretty straightforward. Splatoon, well, it was still kind of different at the time, but we knew what it was. And my point is, these look like pure, straight-up iterations of the franchises they represented. Breath of the Wild was probably the most revolutionary, though looking back, I started arguing that Breath of the Wild was actually a return to form to the original NES Zelda. We could talk about that another day. But these were actually like games for the purists of those series, is what I'm trying to say. This was actually good to me. Another observation I made, and I don't think this has been talked about enough over the last 8 years, is they were really selling the idea of carry your local multiplayer to where you're going. Because all throughout that trailer, yeah, you saw people carrying the Switch with them to play Skyrim by themselves, but they would bring it to the ball court to set up NBA 2K, the famous rooftop party where they were playing Mario 64, or not Mario, but Mario Odyssey, setting up for a tournament with Splatoon. This was really selling the idea of carry this with you to set up local multiplayer wherever you go. To me, that was, whoa. Now, I've been to the Smash tournaments, and I know you can carry your GameCube out there, but to me, this was taking that to a whole different level. And that's a feature I don't think has been emphasized enough looking back, personally. I feel like as time went on, it focused more on just carrying your own Switch with you and playing online, which there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, the thought of carrying the Switch with you, setting up, local online play, or local multiplayer, to me that was the boom shakalaka at that moment in time. Now, moving forward, of course, news started leaking in, and it was good. It was kind of a happier time to be a Nintendo gamer at that point. We get to January where we get to see more about the games and so on, because that's what I want to know about, games. And I remember having a lot of trouble with my internet that night and just having trouble streaming what was going on, and I had to watch the presentation later, like the next day, which I did. And I walked out of that much happier than I was already, and just really looking forward to the launch. I wanted it to launch the next day. Just seeing the stream of games that they were going to have, basically for year one. Obviously, Breath of the Wild was an amazing trailer. Mario Odyssey. I mean, those were probably the two I was really wanting to see walking in. The other really noteworthy one for me ended up being Xenoblade 2, because I was a fan of Xenoblade. I bought Xenoblade Chronicles for Wii, bought the downloaded version again for Wii U, bought Xenoblade X for Wii U. Yeah, I was getting Xenoblade 2, and I did. ARMS looked interesting. I could go on, but the point is that was a solid year one lineup, and probably one of the best year one lineups a console has had. They basically made up for the Wii U drought by just throwing everything they had onto Switch, and it worked. In my mind, it worked. But yeah, I went out to midnight to get my Switch. I was able to work out something to get a pre-order with GameStop. Midnight launch for Switch, grabbed it, took it home. Up late, hooking everything up. Didn't actually play it until the next day, but I took off from work just to do it. I had one of those jobs where you could work from home, and I tried to do what I had to do that day and then play. And I played for launch. What I ended up doing was getting the Switch, Breath of the Wild, of course, and I bought Bomberman. I wanted, the Bomberman game interested me, and what I found was, well, just to get Bomberman out of the way, I enjoyed it. I mean, it was the first Bomberman I played in a long time. I know a lot of people don't talk so much about it. I know it was like the other launch game, but next to Breath of the Wild. But it was a very good example of a Bomberman game. Glad to have it still in my collection. I also have Breath of the Wild, and that if there was ever a game where I could say it just delivered on what it was promising to do in every way, it is definitely that game for me. The fully realized open world Hyrule, it's just everything just works with that game so well. I put hundreds of hours in that game. I'm not trying to make deep dives into these different games I've played, but that was like, to me, I always hold up Ocarina of Time as my favorite Zelda game, or what I think is the best Zelda game, but that one's a good number 2. The only thing it lacks, I think, is a story on the level of Ocarina of Time. They went in a very different direction with it. Open world games kind of require more environmental storytelling by nature, I think. But it's just hard for me to beat Ocarina of Time's story, especially as I get older. And I don't apologize for that. I'd gladly take an Ocarina of Time remake, though. especially if it took on some game of Breath of the Wild's mechanics. I would love it. But at any rate, yes, Breath of the Wild, excellent Zelda game, hundreds of hours into it. It was probably the best launch game Nintendo could have in that moment. To me, when you launch a console and you want it to be successful, you kind of need a lightning in the bottle game to get it sold. Tetris did that for the Game Boy. Breath of the Wild did that for the Switch. No other way to explain it. But going into year 2 of the system, they kept it going. I felt like it was a little slower than the year 1, but the big payoff at the end of that year was Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And what can I say? It is the ultimate. Just having played it, every character, it kind of goes again to what I was trying to say about the Switch, the games featured in that first Switch trailer. Instead of trying to do something very unique, like Nintendo had been doing, I would argue, from the GameCube years through Wii to Wii U, they just tried to make the best version of that franchise. Let's not get real creative here. Let's just do the obvious things, make it the best version of that franchise. Super Smash Ultimate is probably the most literal example of what I'm trying to say. You got Smash Brothers, you got a balance that most people, I think, consider an improvement over the past couple of iterations, and you got everyone is here. They made that clear from the get-go. Everyone is here, and then they added some. And then they added this mode that I get why people would debate it, because that was probably the one innovation it brought. The World of Light mode, I think is what it was called. But I thought it worked well. I thought it integrated event matches well. They basically realized that single player modes are generally just creative event matches anyway, so let's just do that, embrace that. I actually thought it was a great way to go. I thought Ultimate really was the ultimate Smash Brothers game. This comes from a big Melee fan, but it's hard not to look at Ultimate as the ultimate game. Year 3 of Switch. I'm not going to say my favorite games came out that year, or that it was a very, the most memorable year for me. I enjoyed the Link's Awakening remake. Keep in mind this to be 2019. But yeah, I enjoyed the Link's Awakening remake for sure. Particularly noteworthy to me was that was the year I started to feel like third parties were catching up and really putting games onto the system that you didn't think would happen. I remember 2019 being the year, I don't know if they've released right away, but 2019 was a year for me where Square Enix really put into overdrive and tried to at least make sure the old games were coming en masse. I remember playing Final Fantasy VII on my Switch and thinking, the old one, and thinking, how in the world did we get back to the point where these games are on a Nintendo system? For those who remember, or don't remember, Square Enix was very heavy, had a very big presence on Super NES before 3D days with Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. And Square famously kind of parted ways with Nintendo to start putting Final Fantasy and their other franchises on PlayStation, where they stayed for a long time. And just to see some of these games find their way to the Switch eShop, that was kind of mind blowing in itself. I know it's not the big news headline of that year, but for me it kind of was, just to see these things. And they had already started to do that in Japan with Secret of Mana Collection. A major announcement to me was Secret of Mana Collection coming across the ocean for the Switch in North America, and getting that Mana Collection, which I wanted, because Secret of Mana is also one of my all-time favorites. And it's the one that got me into JRPGs. But it was a game I rented at the local rental store and never could find for sale by the time I found it and played it and actually wanted a copy of it. And for me, just a chance to own Secret of Mana was great. I know I'm not talking about some of the things that were probably like the major headlines that year, but those really were the headlines that year for me. And I should probably take a minute aside just to say, Mario Kart 8, I had it for Wii U. I enjoyed it on Switch. I'm probably one of those people that wasn't really that into Mario Kart. And of course, I played it again on Switch for what it was worth. It's not really a front of my mind Switch game. But how about that? It sold so much on Switch. So much. And also, a theme I kind of passed over for year 2 going into year 3 and kind of gone on throughout was just the number of Wii U titles that were given a second chance on Switch. Mario Kart 8 being the biggest and brightest example. But you got to talk about Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. You got to talk about the first Hyrule Warriors game. These are all games that I played on Wii U but bought again on Switch, partly to support, partly because I just wanted the Switch experience with those games. And yeah, for me that was a big deal. But 2019 for me was probably more about the games that were announced to come later. The announcement for that was the year they first teased Breath of the Wild 2. Of course I was going to get that game. Didn't realize how long it would take to get it, but of course I was going to get that game. That was the year they teased Xenoblade Chronicles Remake. Yeah, I was going to get that game. I bought it a third time. One of my favorites of all time as well. And that was probably more what 2019 was to me. Some major games some smaller games I really wanted come out. But also a couple major games teased for the future. Moving along to 2020, of course, that was the year of the pandemic. Glad I had a Switch during that time. I think a lot of people were too. There was a lot of uncertainty that year, and some major things happened in my life. I actually got married in 2020, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I remember the first half of that year being full of just so much uncertainty, because I'm sure everybody else did too. And a lot of people didn't know what Nintendo was doing. It kind of caused a big delay on a lot of things. I remember pre-ordering my Xenoblade Chronicles Remake, remember that from a minute ago, at GameStop, and wondering if I was going to get it. Because, it was just the middle height of the pandemic, stores being closed, all kinds of nonsense going on. And but I did get it. And I remember us going into June with a little more than the direct minis and the partner directs, just wondering what we're going to have go on. And that was the first time I really noticed Nintendo going to Twitter to announce games with Paper Mario, Origami King. And I remember getting that game. It was good. I never was a humongous Paper Mario person, but it was a good iteration of that game too. And kind of goes. I know the battle system, not everybody was happy with it, but it was a good iteration as well. And that's sort of my big memories for 2020. You know, it was just the pandemic caused a big disruption. Games come out. I didn't really jump on the Animal Crossing train. I've never owned an Animal Crossing game, and I didn't jump in this gen. So that was probably the big event of 2020, of course, but I just wasn't a part of that. Going into 21, big game for me that year was the Monster Hunter game Capcom released. And I remember playing it and thinking, yeah, this is peak Switch graphics. Like, this is what happens when a third party dev takes the Nintendo platform seriously. And they did. And you kind of started to see major third party devs, I think, just do more for the Switch by that point. Square had more in the way of new games. But I will take a moment also to just say indie games. I was buying a lot of indie games that year. I was buying them before and I was buying them after. But I remember that year in particular, I bought a lot of indie games just to catch up my catalog of that. And of ones that I wanted, on my wish list. Switch was a real good place for indie games because they really didn't care so much about the hardware limitations, and it was just a good friendly platform where you had handheld play and local play and TV set play too. And Switch really did become a good haven for indie games, and it was all the better for that. Really was. You still see indies go out on Steam first, which that makes sense because a lot of them are still being patched and updated and so on. But it's not strange to see an indie game find its way to Switch as quickly as it can, and that's all the better for that. '22. I remember spending a lot of that year just hoping Breath of the Wild 2 would come out, and it obviously didn't come out that year. But I remember spending a lot of that year just wanting it to come out, hanging on to every announcement for that. A big deal, which I believe was announced in 21, and then we saw it in 22, was Metroid 5 Dread. Again, kind of a mind-blowing moment for me. Like, we're finally getting some games that I think a lot of hardcore Nintendo fans actually wanted, but they weren't always in a hurry to release. But to me, this was a year, 2022 was the year Metroid Dread come out, pretty much. Wanted Breath of the Wild 2, wanted Metroid Dread come out later in the year. That was a big deal for me. And I bought other games other than the ones I've mentioned. I'm just talking about like my personal highlights when I say these things. And Live Alive, I believe, come out that year, and that was I really enjoyed the time I spent with that game as well. Going into 23, a lot of time went into Breath of the Wild 2. I had some downturns in my career in that part of my life, and I actually had a couple months where I was at home a lot, and yeah, I spent time on Breath of the Wild 2. I also spent time late 2021, but a lot of time, especially in 22, finishing a playthrough of Chained Echoes, which was a major indie game for me. The first one I ever invested in a Kickstarter for. No, they didn't pay me to mention it in this thing. I ain't worth that. I ain't worth any sponsorship right now. I know that, but Chained Echoes for me is one of the better games I've played in a long, long time. Especially if you like JRPGs, I recommend anybody play that game. If you want a good indie game, if you want a good JRPG, period, Chained Echoes. But a lot of time went into Breath of the Wild 2 and Chained Echoes during that time. Kind of better spirits towards the end of that year. And going into 24, which was last year, it's kind of comical because I know everybody, and I got to mention Xenoblade 3 as well. Major release, sure. Going into 2024, it's kind of funny because I just remember spending about the whole year, along with everybody else, speculating when we're going to see a Switch 2. And every time you would have expected a direct, I remember all the hype, just thinking we're going to hear something about Switch 2, or we're going to hear something about something. Because by then, you just didn't expect much in the way of game releases, and 24 was a pretty slow year overall. I'll credit Nintendo for finding ways to release a game every month, even if it wasn't a mind-blowing one. Sure. But I ended up spending 24 going through some backlog stuff. I never really got through Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I got in, I believe it was 2018. And so, yeah, I spent time on that in particular, along with some PC games I won't talk about here. But for 2024, my biggest memory probably is going to be just waiting for a Switch 2 announcement. That never came that year. It never actually came that year. And the closest thing we got was, I believe it was in May of 24, Nintendo's president Furukawa saying we will announce something this fiscal year, which of course goes all the way to the end of March this year. But everybody just kept waiting. And probably the highlight of the year for me, aside from that, was, for one, well, the big one was the actual June Direct, which was the only real full-fledged Nintendo Direct we got last year, by the way. It was a slow year. But the highlight for me was having that Direct and the games we got towards the end of the year. Echoes of Wisdom, interesting game to me. I kind of hope they let Grezzo keep making more games along that line. As in, with their art style, the top-down style, and just being creative. Mario Party Jamboree, I'm not a Mario Party person. My wife loves it, though, so of course we got that game. Mario and Luigi, I never was a huge fan of those games. Super Mario RPG, oh yeah, that was a major 2023 game for me, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. And I realize Mario and Luigi are kind of the descendants of that game, but I never really I always wanted more of a return to form to Mario RPG, just being honest. But, it was good to see that return for what it was. But the major highlight to me was that direct closing off, finally, with a trailer for Metroid Prime 4, the game we heard about in 2017, got restarted in development, and now we're actually seeing a dang trailer. That was the highlight of the year for me. Seeing Samus rise up out of her ship, the lighting, jump, everything. It just looked like, is this really a Switch game? That's the way I took it. Like, is this really real? And no, we didn't see much at all of the game. But the graphics looked mind-blowing. The gameplay looked like what I would expect a Prime game to be, with a simple 2025 at the end, with me wishing they'd give us a release date. And so 2024 left me with a game that I was glad to finally see, and I'm hoping is an actual Switch 2 launch or launch window game. I know it said 2025. I hope it's not at the end of the year. I want that game. And I really hope I'm sure they did, but I hope there's something for Switch 2 with that game that makes the graphics even better. Metroid Prime with some ray tracing, people, that will be something. That will be something. $2025. We are, as of this recording, it's March 7th. And all I know to say about this year with Switch 1 as of March 7th is we have Donkey Kong Country Returns HD in January. I did buy it. I am a DK fan. No, I think they didn't do the best port, but it is what it is. Xenoblade X remake, that was something asked for throughout Switch's life, something I wanted. We're getting it at the end of March. I'm happy. I'm happy to see there's still some third-party stuff coming out for Switch. I'm probably going to go out in a minute to look for a copy of Suikoden 1 and 2. I know Lunar Collection Remastered's coming next month. The Dragon Quest remakes, I got that first one for Christmas last year. I'm hoping 2 and 3 are not too far behind. Oh, by the way, Switch, as someone who likes JRPGs and kind of did without on Nintendo systems for many years, so great to have them come back home to Switch, because I have just about all of them, and there were a lot. And I have some of my backlog, to be 100% honest. But Dragon Quest XI, the whole Xenoblade series, going to be on Switch. All of Square Enix's stuff, really. Octopath Traveler 1, 2, Bravely Default 2. Their smaller projects, I Am Setsuna, Lost Sphere, Ononaki, Trials of Mana remake, Diofield Chronicles, Live Alive, all those old Final Fantasies. It has been an amazing console for JRPGs, new and old. It really has. To me, we're finally getting back to the Super NES heyday. And I know some people call that old system the SNES. I always called it the Super NES. I'm not going to change. So, yeah, amazing. With more to come. Chained Echoes, don't forget that one. And for me, that's been great and something I hope continues to Switch too. With Xenoblade X probably being the next big upcoming example of that. And I'd be lying if I said that 2025, the main highlight was not just waiting for that Switch 2. The Switch has had a good run. It's had an amazing library. Switch 2 will inherit that amazing library because we already know back compatibility. So it's been great, but it's also kind of easy to say the best is yet to come. And that's kind of what we're waiting for. The best is yet to come. It's one of the best times I can think of to be an actual Nintendo fan. And that makes me happy. The biggest thing I would want to say about Switch at this point, looking back over 8 years, it's been kind of a up and down 8 years for me. Some of the best things in my life ever happened during this time. I've had a couple of the worst things in my life happen during this time. The good outweighs the bad. I met my wife in 2017 after I got my Switch. And she's not really what I would call a gamer, but she did enter my life and become a big part of my life pretty much at the beginning of this. My work, it's kind of went up and down. My work outside of making these videos, it's kind of went up and down. It's kind of on a down right now. Hoping things pick up and probably will in this early Switch 2 era. So hopefully I can just say it's a better time personally. But some of the best things in my life, like meeting the love of my life, has happened during this time. Some things that made me go forward in life as a person and career-wise happened during this time. And for that, I'll probably never forget this era. Like, if I was to define parts of my life as what Nintendo console was out, Switch 1 era is one of the best. But objectively, I've always held up Super NES as like my favorite console of all time. But when you look at what's in the library now, I kind of have to hold up Switch as the number one now. I sincerely hope Nintendo can keep these games going on future platforms and just build this amazing platform that has this ever-expanding collection. It may never be as big as Steam's platform, but it could rival it for quality if they would just figure out how to hang on to stuff. And I'll leave you with that for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Next time, I hope to talk a little more about just the outlook for Nintendo this year and just kind of focus a little more on the future instead of the last 8 years. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good day.